Hey everybody, it's Erik Torenberg, co-founder, partner of Village Global, a network-driven venture firm. And this is Venture Stories, a podcast covering topics relating to tech and business with world-leading experts. Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Venture Stories by Village Global. I'm here today with a very special guest, Jesse Walden. Jesse was formerly on the crypto team of A16Z and is now branched out to start his own crypto fund called Variant. Jesse, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So Jesse, you've been in the crypto space early. I should be remiss to say that you started a company before A16Z, Media Chain, what was it called? Or what was it called?
Yeah, it was called Media Chain.
And I was focused on music intersection of music and crypto. And your romantic partner is an artist as well. So you're deep with artists. Why don't you talk a little bit about your journey within the crypto space over the last 7 years, particularly how your views have evolved? One thing I've known you've evolved for is your idea that maybe decentralized governance isn't as important as decentralized ownership. Why don't you talk a little bit about how your views have evolved when you give sort of a journey, and then we can get into some of the specifics.
Okay, cool. Well, maybe it'd be helpful to just sort of start with how I got into crypto in the first place, because that informs the rest. So in order to tell that story, I do have to go way back to early 2000s. I was a teenager in high school, and like most teenagers, pretty involved with piracy, but probably like an order of magnitude more than your average. So everyone was downloading MP3s on Napster, but I was sort of part of a scene that congregated around FTP servers, where in order to have access, your IP address had to be whitelisted. In order to get that access or get that whitelist, you needed to play some functional role in the community. So it's very incentives driven, and in that way, kind of like crypto is today. And so, my group was responsible for ripping DVDs and sometimes making them available before they were in stores or even in theaters. And, my incentive as a teenager to participate was, if you uploaded a movie or any file, you got credits to download, and there was every album, video game, TV show, software, etc. on these FTP servers at a time when Netflix was mailing DVDs in the snail mail, and there was no YouTube, there was no Facebook. So having access to all this content was incredible. And then shortly after that, BitTorrent was invented, and then suddenly anyone with a BitTorrent client could get access to those files. Which was great and sort of democratized access and catalyzed streaming as a concept. And then bandwidth and storage got really cheap, and you got file locker services like Mega Upload and RapidShare. And then suddenly distribution of files moved up to the browser, because you do it over HTTP. And that was sort of a really amazing time, because all of these music blogs and film blogs and things popped up, and there was sort of this curation renaissance because anyone could distribute files. And around the same time, because you had the advent of the cloud, you had sort of social networks sort of building and pushing that infrastructure forward. And many of those social networks solved a problem that these protocols that were being used for piracy didn't solve, which is they allowed users to have an identity while also being able to distribute files. So upload your photos to Facebook on your profile, right? Or upload a movie to YouTube, a song to SoundCloud. And so the combination of an identity and the means to distribute files was obviously a very powerful idea, and was sort of the basis for all these social networks. And so that sort of catalyzed the next wave of media distribution, went from piracy to platforms. And during that sort of transition, I was now out of high school into college, and got my start in sort of the business world as a party promoter. And of course, I was using these new social platforms to promote those parties. Parties became concerts, and I found myself sort of getting deep into the music industry, just from starting as a fan and then sort of professionally. Eventually started my own artist management company, where the goal was to use these new media platforms to help artists reach their fans directly through the internet. And so I think that's sort of a straight line through my career is, how does media propagate on the internet, first through piracy, then through platforms, and then using those platforms to help artists sort of avoid the traditional major label system and reach their fans directly. Okay, so where does this intersect with crypto? Well, so it's now 2013 or so, and I learned about Bitcoin, And the thing that resonated with me when I read the Bitcoin white paper was, hey, here's this protocol that in a lot of ways is very similar to BitTorrent and some of the peer-to-peer protocols that came before it. It has a means of propagating data in this peer-to-peer network, but it has something that BitTorrent lacked, which is it has an identity system baked in, and that's public-private key cryptography. And the result is that every Bitcoin in the network or every piece of data in the network is attributed back to the person that wrote it. And that's what allows you to own a Bitcoin independent of the platform that you interface with the network through. So that was a sort of powerful realization for me, because here was a system that allowed you to track a digital asset and attribute it back to its creator anywhere it was distributed. And I thought, hey, what if you could do the same for a different type of asset? Instead of a financial asset, what about a digital media asset? And that was sort of the spark for Media Chain. So, having worked with artists for a number of years and having come face to face with the ways in which they depend on platforms to attribute and monetize their media, I thought, what if artists could be identified or creators could be identified anywhere their media is distributed, and through that channel, that attribution flowed, value could also flow. So that was the spark for Media Chain, which I started with my co-founder Dennis in 2014. And our goal was to build a universal media library, so an open library with all the world's images, videos, songs, where creators could be discovered through their work anywhere it was distributed. So that's the origin story of Media Chain, how I first got into crypto. Now back to your question, what's changed since then? I mean, there's a ton that's changed. The first thing I'll say is back at that point, there were sort of two dominant narratives in the space, and the space was not called crypto. It was called the blockchain space. One narrative was Bitcoin would be the blockchain to rule them all, because it would sort of take on these insurmountable network effects, and everything would be built on top of it. And then the other narrative was that the cool thing was not Bitcoin, but was the blockchain. And that was much more sort of an enterprise adoption story of sort of peer-to-peer databases among large organizations. And we didn't believe either of these stories or narratives at the time, because there we were sort of building our own network. We were not building it on top of Bitcoin because that was impossible technically for what we wanted to do. And we always imagined Media Chain as sort of a developer platform where anyone could build the next big, media application on top of this library of content. And so that was a developer adoption story, not an enterprise adoption story. But this, again, was 2014, and there wasn't a whole lot of developer activity in the space. And so, what we were seeing back then was a lot of interest inbound from enterprise organizations, one of whom was Spotify, that ended up acquiring Media Chain Labs to solve a sort of painful problem that they had, which was, there is no library of all the information about who wrote a song. And as a result, they get sued all the time for not knowing who to pay royalties to. And it's not that they don't want to pay. They do have the royalties ready to go. They just don't know who to pay. And they thought a peer-to-peer solution would be the right one. And Media Chain architecture made a lot of sense for solving that sort of problem. But I'd say one thing that's really changed a ton since back then is the amount of developer activity in the space. So we joined Spotify very beginning of 2017. That was right before there was a big run-up in the crypto markets. And that was, sort of a double-edged sword for us, because we were sort of kicking ourselves. The first week we got to Spotify, the price of Ethereum, I think, went from 80 cents to $80. And so we were like, wow, if we just hung on a little bit longer, there'd be all this interest and market activity. But the flip side of that was a really crazy time in the space. And so trying to operate through that period would have also been, I would say, traumatic to say the least. So in a sense, glad we landed at Spotify and got to sort of reset from first principles. But certainly what that phase of the industry catalyzed was like way more developer interest in the space. And now, I think you see there's much better developer tooling, much better infrastructure, and just way more ecosystem activity of developers building on top of each other's work. And that was something that was missing a lot from our vision at the time in 2014 to 2016.
There was this camp of Bitcoin maximalists who said not only that it would be the dominant protocol for everything, I remember we were getting lunch or something, and you were saying that's like saying that there, only TCP will work, and there can be no other protocols. But they were saying sort of that it's money more than it is technology, and we need to look at the history of money more so than we need to look at the history of technology. What did they not, or where is sort of the verdict on sort of Bitcoin maximalism versus Ethereum or other sort of base layer protocols?
So Bitcoin maximalists, I think, have this view that that there's only one use of a cryptocurrency, and that's sort of a non-sovereign store of value. And at A16Z, I think one of the sort of shared views there is that crypto is actually a much sort of broader platform for innovation. And so I think like everyone at A16Z would classify themselves as sort of like innovation maximalists, not Bitcoin maximalist. And innovation maximalist is inclusive of Bitcoin. But Bitcoin maximalism is not inclusive of other forms of innovation. Sort of like Bitcoin was invented and then nothing else can come after that. And so I definitely don't hold that view. That said, I think, in terms of what I think crypto is good for, I do think it's sort of along the spectrum of value creation and distribution. So there's, non-sovereign store of value. In the case of Bitcoin, Ethereum is this general purpose sort of computing platform, but I think it's especially well suited to applications concerned with the sort of movement of value. I think it's very clear that's one of the key applications of blockchains as computers, right? So Chris Dixon has this really great way of framing blockchains as a general purpose computing platform where they meet the very basic definition of a Turing machine. It's a machine you can sort of give an input to, run a function on that input, get an output, and record that output in some state, which is the blockchain. So a blockchain is a computer by that definition. It's just a virtual computer that runs on physical computers all over the world. And the way in which blockchain computers are different from other computers that have come before is that they sort of suck on most dimensions. They're slow, they're sort of like inefficient, they're expensive to run, but they're able to offer guarantees that the computations that they do are done correctly. And that's a really important guarantee for applications like digital money or digital gold. And so that's why I think that, the types of applications that are well suited to being run on blockchain networks are those that require a high degree of trust and are probably along the spectrum of value creation and distribution. Now, I think that view of blockchains as trustworthy computers is correct, but it doesn't really, specify how it will touch the end user, and that's something that I'm really interested in, try to spend a lot of time on. And there, I think we sort of get back a little bit to your earlier question about decentralized governance, versus ownership. So one way of thinking about the space that I think is interesting is to sort of go back to my history with piracy and look at how piracy evolved. So I touched on BitTorrent earlier. BitTorrent was this technology unlock that I think exposed a latent demand that was impossible to see before the technology made it visible. And that was, BitTorrent enabled you to access files as if they were already on your hard drive. You could start streaming a movie or a song the instant you downloaded it in a BitTorrent client. Little known fact is Daniel Ek, the CEO of Spotify, was CEO of MuTorrent before Spotify. And MuTorrent was one of the biggest BitTorrent clients at that time. So he sort of had a front row seat to what was going on the BitTorrent network. And, there was all this, at one point it was taking up a third of all internet bandwidth. And so he saw, hey, like there's this real latent demand here. People want to access files now. And when he started Spotify, the goal was to build a product that gave users the experience of every song ever as if it's already on your hard drive. That, clearly was a good idea. And a sort of even lesser known fact is that in the earliest days of Spotify, it actually used BitTorrent under the hood because that was the best tool for that job. It was the best way to give users that experience of every song as if it's already on your hard drive. Now, I think the important insight there is you had this technology unlock, surface the latent demand for streaming, but then the beneficiary of that were companies like Spotify and Netflix, which packaged that latent demand into an intuitive product to use. Now, the parallel in crypto that I think is interesting is Ethereum was protocol innovation that similarly gave us or unlocked another sort of latent demand, mass latent demand that was impossible to see prior. And I think that was the 2017 ICO boom, or certainly that's a favorable treatment of the 2017 ICO boom. So you basically saw for the first time, retail, everyday internet users being able to invest in products and services that they thought they might use every day. At least that was what they were told, right? And of course, that attracted a lot of bad actors, and a lot of the products never ended up shipping. But it was the first time that value proposition was offered to users, where you can own a piece of the platforms and services you interact with every day. And I think, sure, you could say that the 2017 ICO boom was just about greed, but that's sort of like saying BitTorrent was just about stealing. That's not really the correct or complete view of what was really going on. I think the reason that there was all this greed and hype in the 2017 ICO boom is people are not dumb, and they know internet platforms are valuable. They know that the value of those platforms is due to their contributions. And here, for the first time, was an offer to actually receive some of that value and be aligned with the platform as it grows. And of course, Bitcoin and Ethereum are the first very clear examples of that. And I think that, many more community-driven platforms will follow suit. So one thing I think is interesting about blockchain computers and tokens in particular as an application is, tokens are this technology innovation that turns value into packets, just like BitTorrent turned, movies into packets that you could stream. And so the cost of distributing them and moving them around really fast and really granularly is basically zero. And as a result, I think you can start to sort of action upon this latent demand that was expressed in 2017, and products and services built with economic collaboration with their communities in mind from first principles, I think is a really exciting opportunity for crypto to start touching end users, or start touching the end user experience. Effectively, ownership of the platform becomes part of the product experience. And I think that's a really powerful idea.
And this is why you're so excited about co-ops, right? Or sort of what crypto can do to co-ops is sort of make them feasible?
Yeah. So I think like co-ops are a good historical analogy for crypto networks. So, cooperatives are a sort of like classical legal structure, different way of organizing a company. So instead of a company being owned by shareholders, it's owned by members, and members can sort of define the rules of the company. Very often, the members decide, hey, this cooperative is not going to be profit maximizing. Instead, it's going to serve our interests, whatever they define those interests as. So, for example, like REI is a big outdoor, goods manufacturer and retailer. It's a cooperative, and the members, decide that, number one, they want to take care of the environment. Number two, any profits that the company makes from selling its goods are going to be redistributed to the members as a function of how much they spend every year at the cooperative. And so that's like a really interesting organizational structure, because it enables the organization to remain aligned with its members even as it grows. Whereas, traditional corporations have the singular mandate of extracting profit for shareholders. That's the concept of shareholder primacy. So that's I think the keystone difference between cooperatives and corporations. And crypto networks are similar to cooperatives in that they too are community owned and operated. And as a result, they sort of, number one, they distribute value back to their members, and number two, they can remain aligned with users as they grow, because if they diverge from that alignment in any way, the fact that they're open source allows the community to sort of react and fork off and govern the thing the way that they want it to be governed. And you see this happening just this past week. Justin Sun and the Tron Foundation, which is sort of a large cap crypto network, tried to acquire a smaller blockchain, Steemit, and the community rebelled against this and decided, we don't want to be acquired by this, this foundation that we have nothing to do with. And so they actually just forked off the the whole blockchain and said, you know what, we're all going over to this fork, so you can't acquire it. So I think that's a good example of the community coming together to govern the thing as they see fit for their interests. So all that to say, I think cooperatives are a good analogy for crypto networks. They're both community owned and operated organizations. But the key, one key difference is historically cooperatives, I think, have been encumbered by the complexity of organizing in this way. So, it's not a vanilla Delaware C Corp. There's much more nuance to governing a cooperative successfully. And a lot of that nuance is captured in legal documents. So it's hard if you're trying to get a cooperative off the ground. You have to spend all this money on lawyer bills to get your governance right, because your bylaws are very custom. And so it's been expensive, and it doesn't really scale well to large groups. But with crypto, the opportunity is to sort of take all that logic of how you govern the organization and turn it into code. And as a result, it's far more lightweight, easy to distribute and scale. It's sort of like what we've done with marketplaces and all kinds of other sort of legacy services in turning them into internet services. They've scaled much better, much bigger. And we now have the opportunity to do that to the very organizational structures that coordinate these large internet platforms themselves. Yes. We can turn those into code too.
So paint me a picture here a little bit. So what Spotify was to Napster, what is that to the ICO?
Yeah, so I think it's a great question, and I think we're still scratching the surface of what that looks like. But I think some early examples that are happening right now. I think a good one is Compound, which is a money market protocol. So it's obviously not Spotify. It's a different kind of marketplace, but it's a marketplace that coordinates lenders and borrowers, and it runs as a smart contract on Ethereum. And at the outset, the smart contract was built by Compound, a traditional Delaware C Corp company. They built the smart contract. They built an interface on top of it, and that interface looks very much like a Web 2 product that would be intuitive for most users to use. That interface was sort of the first way to interact with this protocol. But today you've got an ecosystem of 10, 20 different third-party companies building on top of that canonical smart contract that Compound, the company, built. And as a result of all these sort of integrations sitting on top, there's now a pretty good network effect of liquidity in this marketplace of borrowers and lenders. And just like traditional marketplaces sort of build defensibility through liquidity and network effects, Compound has done the same and is now, I think, in a good position to charge a fee. Just like Airbnb charges a fee or Uber charges a fee in their marketplace. So the business model is kind of similar, but the key difference is who benefits from that business model, right? So you've got this fee stream. What do you do with it? Well, it could just go back to the company, but that may not be the best use of the fee stream. Another idea might be to take that fee stream and actually distribute it to the parties that are contributing to the network effects that makes Compound valuable in the first place. So you might take that fee stream and distribute it to those third-party developers who are, contributing liquidity to the protocol. And in doing so, you would sort of align their incentives with the protocol itself, and they'd be, then incentivized to keep contributing liquidity over time. And as a result of sort of giving your community ownership, you could imagine the Compound protocol continuing to grow unabated, and it's much better to have a whole ecosystem of developers contributing to it as opposed to just this one company. So community owned and operated networks like Compound as an example, I think could stand to be much bigger, much more defensible than sort of their Web 2 counterparts, which are just a single company. So I think that's what it may look like, or one example of what it may look like. And I do think that this concept of community owned and operated networks is a very horizontal one. I think it can play out across many different verticals where, the money marketplace I just described is just one of those.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned defensibility there because typically Web 2 startups are often defensible by their sort of data network effects and that they close them off. Whereas in crypto, that's more open source, and so defensibility seems that it's more like brand or community driven. And I'm curious how you think about defensibility. I'm also curious how you think about value capture, because Dropbox was able to, lock in people to their service and charge them and create choke points along the way. Whereas if Filecoin is, saving so much value, presumably they'd be a lot less valuable than Dropbox. I'm curious how you think about defensibility and value capture.
Yeah. Well, so I think it's actually it's pretty similar to Web 2. And you're right, you're right that crypto networks are open source. They're open source by necessity because that's the way you're able to sort of engender trust that the computation is being done correctly. And so, of course, given that they're open source, you can fork the code, right? But it's important to keep in mind that the code itself is not really what's valuable, right? Like, so classic example, think of open source code library, something like MongoDB, right? The code itself is free, but MongoDB Inc. is a valuable company because they take that code and they instantiate it as a running service, right? And it's the running service that ends up capturing value or being valuable. A database with nothing in it isn't worth anything, but a database filled with users and their data starts to become, a valuable service that developers can build on top of. And network effects can be built around, right? Each new entry in the database increases the value of the database for everyone else, presumably, or each new user of a social network increases the value for all other users. And so live running services are the foundation for value capture in Web 2, and crypto networks are live running services. They are open source code, but they are running instances of that open source code. So you can fork the code, but that's not where the value is. The value is in the community that's interacting with that live running service. And that's why I think we've seen there's been many forks of Bitcoin, but there's still the canonical instance of Bitcoin that most people interact with. So some of the defensibility of, in crypto networks comes from brand, as you mentioned, and sort of the Lindy effect of that brand being around and being tested and true. But then there's also softer stuff like all the integrations, right? Like how are you going to coordinate all of the third-party services that have integrated with this canonical instance of a service to move to the fork, right? There's less friction than forking Facebook because their code is proprietary, but there's still non-zero friction. And so whatever that friction introduces a switching cost, right? And my view is that whatever the switching cost is creates a margin that can be extracted, and so network effects equal switching costs equal margin equals value capture. That's sort of the formula for crypto networks. And the value capture may be less than Web 2 because the switching costs are less, but they're non-zero. And that's okay. I think, the idea that you can take that margin and redistribute it to the community means that you don't need to extract as much value. You can build a sustainable service that covers its costs and redistributes any excess to the community members directly, which in turn makes the service even more defensible because the users have a stake in continuing to see it succeed.
Yeah. So we won't see things necessarily as big as Facebook today, but it's still big. And also in theory, if everyone, hated Facebook, they wouldn't be stuck there. They'd have some switching costs, but less switching costs that they'd be able to fork over much easier.
Yeah, I think it's those two things, and they're different, right? Like the latter statement is, yeah, you can leave if you don't like it, and that to the example I described earlier, we've seen that happen a number of times, and that's a good thing, I think, for community members. But the flip side is, you can have to your point that the value capture may be less. That doesn't necessarily mean that investment returns or the value for founders is necessarily less, because while you may extract less value from the network, you could also theoretically build networks that are much bigger than their Web 2 counterparts because you're giving some of that value to the community members directly, and that gives them skin in the game to see the platform succeed. So Bitcoin doesn't have a marketing department; they don't have that cost, or the network doesn't have that cost because the community members do that work, right? So you simultaneously need to extract less value, but can also build bigger networks at lower cost. And I think that's a really powerful idea. It means that you can have more value through scale, but with less extraction.
Totally. Another idea I want to segue to, we've explored in our conversations the past couple of years, have been sort of ISAs and personal tokens. And really something you've thought a lot about is sort of debt versus equity. Why don't you sort of share a little bit of what you've learned there and what's your mental model for it?
Yeah, so this is also, I think, very much informed by conversations I've had with Chris Dixon. So I want to give him credit where it's due. I think like a good framework for thinking about debt versus equity is how much information and trust each of them require. So, a debt contract is a much simpler type of arrangement. It's sort of like, I will lend you this money and you pay me back with interest. And if you don't pay me back, I'm coming for everything you've got. And in countries where there's good rule of law, that's pretty straightforward. Although right now that's all, kind of an influx. But in normal times, a debt contract is a very simple contract. And so it requires relatively little information to issue a loan and give someone credit or to determine their credit worthiness. Equity, on the other hand, is much more complicated, right? Because the capital in the relationship doesn't have this same sort of recourse. They don't get to say, hey, if you don't pay me, if I don't make a return on my investment, I'm coming for everything you've got. It's more of a partnership. You're more sort of aligned with whomever it is you're investing in and buying equity from. And so that type of arrangement requires way more information and way more trust, right, in the partner. Like one interesting thing to think about is, how the economy might evolve given the fact that today we have the internet. There's, a way to move information very cheaply. And now we have blockchain computers where you can trust that the computation that they're doing is being done correctly. So you can sort of audit, all the code and say, oh yeah, this thing is going to, do what it says it's going to do. So you can gain trust that way. And so it's sort of now possible to imagine you could have, applications, organizations built on this infrastructure where, because they're completely open source, there's lots of information and their code is run in this trustworthy way, it's much easier to have sort of equity relationships with all kinds of organizations, maybe even individuals, at a really granular level, where it just didn't make sense to finance things in that way prior, because the bar to information and trust was too high. So many of the like economic arrangements that are today debt arrangements could end up becoming equity arrangements. And I think that gets into, ISAs, where today, like much of student, college financing is financed through debt, but potentially in the future, built on this infrastructure, you could have more equity-like arrangements like income share agreements. So to make that more concrete, like imagine you've got a Lambda school graduate who is now in the workforce as an engineer, and they're getting paid, say, in U.S. dollars, but those U.S. dollars are coming to them through USD token on the Ethereum blockchain, right? So you can audit their income, or in a verifiable way. You can see exactly how much they earn, when it's going to hit their wallet, based on these smart contracts that are going to run as specified. Well, you've got a lot more trust there and information there than you had in the legacy world, where that all of those transactions are happening on some opaque infrastructure that you have no visibility into. So it might, it theoretically is possible to get comfortable backing this person, given that higher, or that lower bar to information and trust that you get from blockchains.
I was going to ask, where are we at with personal tokens? And what do you see for that moving forward?
Yeah, it's an interesting idea. I think I'm more in the camp that like specific types of arrangements can work both in ISAs and in personal token world. So I think personal tokens are the idea that a person can have a market tied to shares of themselves, and those tokens can be redeemed for whatever the person specifies. It could be a slice of their income. It could be you get to vote on what they have for dinner, and not all of these interaction models will work, but some of them will, right? And right now it's not entirely clear which ones will be first, but I do tend to think that they'll be around sort of income splitting. And one of the most interesting examples here is NBA player Spencer Dinwiddie on the Brooklyn Nets just recently tokenized his contract, and I think it's $35 million player salary, and you can buy a share in it up front, and it's sort of, so he's sort of like issuing a bond for his salary. It's very similar to what David Bowie did in the 80s with Bowie bonds, though that was sort of done on the legacy stack, and Spencer Dinwiddie's doing it on Ethereum. And so I think that kind of model will likely be a common one to start, but then we'll probably see all kinds of experimentation with alternate interaction models. Like there's friend Ruben issued a token that's redeemable for an hour of his time. He's a lawyer, so an hour of his time, not legal advice, but just sort of general consulting, and that I think is, it's an alternate model. But the question there is, how many people want to sell their time on a free marketplace where the price can go up and down versus control the value of their time and control who can claim it. And so I think a lot of these things need to be worked out still, and it's sort of unclear. I'm not. I'd say on personal tokens, I'm a little bit skeptical that there's going to be every flavor under the sun, and I'm looking for that one interaction model that's repeatable, and we haven't seen it yet.
What are the things that you're most the opposite hopeful about or eager to see? Like, what's your request for startups or applications or use cases on top of some of this new technology?
Yeah, so I think basically what I look for and what I want to see more founders doing is sort of approaching the space from a product first point of view. So like, last 15, 20 years of Silicon Valley learned very, very much that you need to build a product that people want and start from there. And I think, there's been so much technology innovation in crypto in such a short amount of time. And that's great, and it provides a new foundation. But in that sort of flurry of tech innovation, I think the space has sort of lost touch with the end user, and we need to start focusing on that again. And so what I look for are sort of product-driven teams that are sort of thinking about marketplaces or community-driven networks, networks where people contribute the value to the service. And then from first principles, look for ways to reward that community economically for their contributions. And so, I think the difference between what I'm describing and say Web 2 platforms where users maybe have some sort of revenue share is that in many of those Web 2 platforms, revenue share was an afterthought, right? It was something that you added once the platform got to scale, once you had power users that were threatening to leave, you worked out some revenue share arrangement for them. But what I'm most interested in are sort of products and services that are community driven from the outset, and where the community members are there because they own a piece of the platform from day one. And again, I think Bitcoin, Ethereum, crypto networks are only the first examples of community driven platforms owned and operated by their users. But given the right tools, I think many more communities, potentially every subreddit, can build their own community owned and operated platform. And so we need the tools to do it, and then we also need the platforms and product-driven founders to sort of execute that playbook.
Totally. One thing you've coined is this concept of crypto-adjacent startups. So, talk about that, because the things I've been most excited about, ISAs, prediction markets, some of this dynamic pricing. We're talking fractionalization. Does it even require crypto? So is the idea that the infrastructure isn't yet ready for it, but it will soon, or how do you think about this?
Yeah, and so I think like my definition of crypto adjacent is sort of what I just described earlier, which is it's startups that are sort of heeding the insights emerging from the crypto space, namely community ownership, community operation, and say in sort of how the product evolves, and making that a core part of the product experience. That's what crypto adjacent means to me. And then there's a question, which is, does that kind of startup need to run on top of a blockchain or not? And there, I think, just like Spotify used BitTorrent under the hood in the early days, I think that crypto networks are probably the right tool for the job here. It's the right stack. If you want to distribute value like we distribute bits of information at very low cost, then crypto is the right stack to do that, right? Because trying to do that over the legacy financial stack is cumbersome, and it's expensive and not permissionless to innovate on. And so I tend to think that, crypto adjacent startups may start product first. They may start sort of, with building a great product experience and abstracting all the infrastructure that's under the hood. But technically, I do believe crypto networks are the right tool for the job. And so I think that a lot of this, adjacent innovation will end up moving on sort of the new rails that crypto offers.
Give us a minute on central bank digital currency and dollarization. I didn't even think about that.
Yeah, so I think one of the interesting phenomenons over the last year is like you've seen all these stablecoin projects come out. There's different flavors. There's dollar-backed stablecoins like USDC, where there's literally a physical or cash dollar in a bank account somewhere for every token that represents that dollar on the blockchain. And then there's completely decentralized ones like Maker, which use other crypto assets as collateral. And create stable assets against those volatile crypto assets under the hood. And then there's projects like Libra and Celo, which are their own blockchains with their sort of own mechanisms for stability. But all these point to solving a problem that I think is an important one in the crypto space, which is volatility. Like there's tons of the market's very volatile, and as a result, it's hard to onboard people to the space. And one of the opportunities I think with sort of tokenized dollars is access to dollars for people who can't get them locally. And that can take many forms. It could be you want to earn in a currency that's more stable than your own. So Amazon Mechanical Turk worker, and you want to hold dollars because it's more stable than whatever currency is local. And tokenization of dollars makes it easier and cheaper for you to do that because you don't need a US bank account. You can just use a crypto wallet. So I think one of the surprising and interesting things going on is demand for tokenized dollars is proving to be a real thing. And with all the volatility in the traditional financial markets and the crypto markets going on right now in this COVID craze, there's actually been a huge increase in demand for stable coins. And that's probably driven by speculation. But it's highlighting that, stable dollar tokens are sort of as valuable, store of value as traditional dollars as a safe haven asset off chain. And so I think we're going to see like over the next year, this trend sort of really accelerate, and there start to be more and more adoption of dollars as sort of stable currency, reserve currency, which it already is, but where way more people can get access to it because the cost of using these rails is far lower than the cost of using the traditional banking system. And so that's pretty exciting because it means that crypto penetration, crypto adoption isn't driven by some like crazy volatile asset that people don't really know or trust. It's driven by the US dollar. And I think that's a really good sort of on-ramp, for folks that already hold the dollar in high regard and can reason about it. So suddenly everyone gets a crypto wallet in order to get dollars. And then you can start to put all kinds of other crypto assets into that wallet, including, for example, ownership of a product or service that you contribute to. So dollars may end up being the way that many people experience crypto to start, and it may be the way that that people start to experience ownership of services that they use every day through crypto assets that are denominated in dollars.
Last question. You've written about progressive decentralization. Where basically in the beginning there was this idea that it was important to decentralize governance and decentralize all the things. And then I think over time we sort of stopped caring about that element of it. What did we just realize it was hard, or we realized that centralized systems for governance can work really well, or what was the learning there? And then the second part of the question, lastly, is what's your sort of unique insight on business models in crypto and our mental model for them?
Yeah. So on progressive decentralization, I think. It's the basic idea is that there's like sort of three key stages to building a product in crypto. Stage one is, again, you got to build a product people want. If you don't do that, like there's no value to capture. There's no way you're going to sustain a community. So build a product you want. Stage two is once you have a product and you're starting to maybe have some network effects around that product. Hopefully you're developing a community alongside it. And the community are those that are generating the network effects. This is classic startup playbook: build a product, build a community. Next stage in the playbook is a bit different, and that is to turn ownership of the product or service over to the community. And I think that's the thing that's new in crypto. And I think unfortunately a lot of products have executed this playbook in the wrong order. So 2017, people started with step 3, which is distribute ownership of this thing that we haven't even built yet through an ICO, right? So that distributing ownership is not the right place to start, because then you then have to work backwards from there to building a community and then building a product. And designing a product by committee is generally not a good idea in my view. So you want to start product first, lean team, execute quickly, like rapid iteration. And there you don't want the community involved in decision making or governance. You want to just move quickly and build something people want. Once you've validated the product works and you have product market fit, then you can start to involve the community in decision making to some degree. But probably more importantly, you want to give them real economic alignment and through ownership of the product or service. And so I think the playbook is to start product first and then progressively decentralize ownership of the product to the community. And with that could come, community decision making. But I think, organizing large groups of people to make decisions collectively is, not a problem that cryptography solves. It's a very human problem. And so, I think we'll get lots of experiments in how decisions are made in community-owned organizations, because it's much easier to iterate on that decision-making process now that it's code. It's not legal contracts. That said, I think a good place to start is probably tested and true decision-making processes. For example, delegation. Like the most successful cooperatives at scale, and there are a number of them that are multi-billion-dollar organizations, they have a traditional management structure with a CEO and a COO, and those execs answer to the owners, which are the community members that own the product or company or cooperative. So I think we'll likely land on something similar to start, where products are owned by their communities, but they still have sort of hierarchical leadership, and you don't really need to decentralize all decision making to every node in the network, because people don't have time or appetite for that. I think a good quote here that I picked up from Brad at USV is an Oscar Wilde quote that the problem with socialism is it takes up too many evenings, and I think that the same is probably true in terms of large scale collective decision making in crypto networks. You probably want to delegate that decision making to some expert, and so long as that there's a check and balance in place, so that if they move against your intent or your interest, you can replace them.
Do you have a hot take for how crypto will disrupt VC? Are we going to have
I think
cap tables?
Yeah, so I think like in the long run, there will be some disruption, but it's not going to be as dramatic as some were predicting in 2017, where some were saying it's going to eliminate it completely. I think it could change the dynamics of VC. So earlier we touched on the idea that crypto networks are less extractive than corporate owned networks, because they're community owned and operated, and so they don't need to return a profit to shareholders. They just need to be sustainable and sort of reward their communities commensurate with the value they contribute, right? So they're less extractive. That could mean that the role for VC is to get to be in earlier and to invest at valuations that maybe are slightly lower. And that's because the exit for these types of startups may be to the community rather than to a large group of third-party shareholders who are sort of indifferent to whether they use the platform or not. So a classic IPO is to shareholders that are profit maximizing, whereas a successful crypto network is owned and operated by the community members that use the service. So it could mean that VCs come in earlier to help the product get built and get off the ground, but ultimately see the exit as one that is to the community, and that's at potentially a lower valuation to start, because the community is not seeking to maximize profits, right? So maybe lower multiples.
Is there anything else you wanted to say from your blog post on business models?
On business models, no. I think we covered business models. I think the key idea with business models in crypto is that the business model is familiar. Crypto networks are marketplaces, right? Bitcoin is a marketplace between people who want to store and transfer value and miners that secure the ledger of those value transfers. So there's demand and supply on both sides of crypto networks. And that demand and supply creates network effects through liquidity in a marketplace. When you have network effects, you have switching costs. And when you have switching costs, you're able to extract a margin. And so the model is to charge a fee, just like marketplaces charge a fee. So every Bitcoin transaction you have to send it with a fee attached. Every Ethereum function that you run, you have to pay gas. That's also a fee. At the application layer, Compound, the lending market protocol we covered, and Uniswap, a sort of exchange, they all have fees. So the business model is familiar. What's new is what you do with that fee stream. So instead of it going to shareholders, it's going to community members that actually contribute value to the protocol. And that's what creates a virtuous loop that further enforces the network effect of these marketplaces, because those that provide the value are actually getting some of it and are incentivized to stay there. Anything we didn't get to cover that you wanted to cover, or any plugs for Variant that we should close with? So to my point earlier about sort of how we disrupt, how crypto is likely to disrupt VC, I think Variant is sort of strategically sized for this opportunity. So it's a small fund focusing on very early stage founders. Core insight being that crypto networks crypto adjacent founders will move to turn ownership over to the community. And as a result, if you want to play as a VC in this space, you need to back founders early, and sort of assume that after, say, Series A, the likely next step is liquid token that community members own. And so you have to play earlier, and that's what I'm trying to do with Variant. My guest today has been Jesse Walden of Variant. I've been trying to get him on for a few years, and he did not disappoint. Jesse, thank you so much for a fantastic episode. Thanks for having me.
If you're an early stage entrepreneur, we'd love to hear from you. Check us out at villageglobal.vc.